For this week's Big Train Tour here at the Colorado Railroad Museum, we are going to be taking a look at Denver and Rio Grande Western diesel-electric freight locomotive number 5401, which is known as a tunnel motor. Built by General Motors Electromotive Division in LaGrange, Illinois, this locomotive was delivered to the Rio Grande in March 1980. It served all across the DNRG system and continued to power trains even after the Rio Grande became part of the sprawling Southern Pacific system in 1988. With the SP's 1996 merger into the Union Pacific system, tunnel motor number 5401 continued in service, renumbered, for a short while longer before being retired and ultimately donated to the museum in 2010. Today we're going to take a look into this fascinating artifact's origins and dive into the hows and whys of a locomotive that was specifically designed for mountain railroading and especially for tunnels. A diesel locomotive is by design an electric locomotive with a mobile generator, the diesel engine, riding along to provide the power source. The earliest diesel engines were rather large, and starting in the early years of the 20th century, they generated comparatively small amounts of horsepower relative to their size and weight. Thus, they were not well suited to application on railroad locomotives. Steam locomotives were far more powerful, comparatively speaking. But just as with any technology, diesel locomotive development continued. Power output rose relative to the size and weight, and by the 1930s, diesel engines were powering some of America's early streamlined passenger trains, including some right here in Colorado. This was made possible by a parallel development of lightweight passenger equipment being introduced, meaning that it would take less horsepower to pull a passenger train. Diesel locomotives were still limited, however, when it came to pulling heavy freight trains, and especially if mountains were involved. Their limited horsepower per engine meant that they were best suited only for yard switching and other more specialized uses at first. But World War II saw huge advances in diesel engine technology. Horsepower rose while size and weight continued to decline. Once the war was over, America's railroads began an irreversible march away from steam locomotion in favor of the diesel. This was helped by the fact that the steam locomotive itself was reaching the limits of its technology. By the mid-1950s, most Western mainline railroads had dieselized. Even though more actual locomotives were required to pull trains, these new diesels were vastly easier to maintain and less expensive to operate. The Denver and Rio Grande Western was no different, retiring its last standard gauge steam locomotives in 1956. So what about our tunnel motor? Well, starting in the 1960s, General Motors and competitors Alco and General Electric strove to build higher horsepower and more efficient locomotives. Early diesels were wearing out and in need of replacement, and railroad companies at that time were not doing well financially. They were looking for new locomotive models that could pull heavier and longer trains more efficiently, with less actual locomotives being needed. The Denver and Rio Grande Western was especially interested in purchasing more powerful locomotives, as the railroad had decided that running shorter and faster trains gave it a competitive edge relative to the mountainous territory the railroad ran through. Along with the Southern Pacific, another Western railroad that ran through a number of mountain ranges, the Rio Grande in the early 1960s purchased high-horsepower German locomotives from builder Krauss Maffei as an experiment. The Rio Grande quickly decided that the German locomotives were not well suited for its railroading needs, but it did actively begin purchasing newer locomotives from General Motors Electromotive Division and retiring older, lower horsepower models from its locomotive fleet. From wartime horsepower ratings of 1,500 horsepower per locomotive, improvements were made rapidly in the 1960s. From 2,000 to 25 horsepower, then up to 3,000 and even 3,600 horsepower per locomotive, the advances were incredible and relatively fast. It was into this setting that we make our way back to our tunnel motor. The museum's tunnel motor, number 5401, is a 6-axle model SD40T-2. It weighs a whopping 368,000 pounds, measures in nearly 71 feet long, and it's over 10 feet wide. SD is short for Special Duty, meaning that this is a road service locomotive. The 40 indicates the particular model number that its builder used. General Motors had several contemporary models, in particular during the 1960s and 70s, all identified in increments of either 5 or 10, such as the SD30 and 35, the SD40 and 45, and so on. The -2 means that this is the improved model of the SD40, introduced a few years into production. But in all of their numbers and letters, the T is what makes this a tunnel motor. This locomotive was built to pull heavy trains through the mountains, quickly according to the Rio Grande's operating model. It is powered by a 3,000 horsepower turbocharged diesel engine and equipped with dynamic brakes, which had become a standard item for Western railroads by this time. But why would the railroad need anything special beyond all of this? Why not just order one of the standard SD40 models from Electromotive? The answer lies in the characteristics of the Denver and Rio Grande's routes and the demands they placed on the locomotives that pulled its trains over the rails. There was the original standard gauge main line from Denver to Salt Lake City via Pueblo, the Royal Gorge and Tennessee Pass, completed in 1891. And there was the Moffatt Road shortcut between Dot Zero and Denver via the Moffatt Tunnel, a more direct route that was not fully completed until the 1930s. Both of these routes featured hefty grades and tunnels. And while the Moffatt Tunnel route had more favorable grades, its main tunnel was one of the longest in North America at some 6 miles total. The tunnel motor design featured air cooling intakes that were relocated on the locomotive car body to meet a special need. Typically, these intakes are located on the roof of a diesel locomotive, as far away from road dirt and kicked up dust as they can be. But when operating in enclosed areas such as a tunnel, this is not the place you want cooling air intakes to be located. It's where the hottest and most polluted air can be found, and using this hot, polluted air for cooling can lead to overheating and shutdown of the engine. That's not something you want to have happen inside a 6-mile-long tunnel. The tunnel motor was developed specifically to avoid overheating situations like this. Only 2 railroads ever purchased tunnel motors. Both railroads operated routes with significant enclosed snowshed mileage and/or fully enclosed tunnels. The Southern Pacific and its Cotton Belt subsidiary bought nearly 480 tunnel motors between them, and with some of those being the same model as the Rio Grande bought, and others being an even more powerful model, the SD45T-2. The Rio Grande bought 73 of these big machines, quite a financial commitment for the 1970s and 1980s. These locomotives would serve the railroad well for over 25 years through 3 different ownership identities. Our locomotive, Rio Grande number 5401, was not renumbered or painted into Southern Pacific colors during the years 1988 to 1996 when the Rio Grande became part of Southern Pacific. It continued to pull trains as a Rio Grande locomotive all across the system. Following the Union Pacific merger, it continued its wanderings outside of Colorado and New Mexico to pull trains elsewhere on the sprawling UP system, even ending up in Southern California at times. In 2005, several years after the Union Pacific merger with Southern Pacific, our tunnel motor was renumbered by UP to 8594. The official reason given was to clear the earlier number series to make way for other newer diesel locomotives that were being built for UP. Just 2 years later, it was again renumbered, this time to 9871. Both times the locomotive was not repainted into Union Pacific colors, but simply patched to show a different number in UP colors on top of its old Rio Grande paint scheme. Retired shortly after its second renumbering, our tunnel motor was officially donated to the Colorado Railroad Museum by the Union Pacific Railroad in 2010. After this locomotive's donation, a new saga began for tunnel motor 5401. There was no direct rail connection to the Colorado Railroad Museum, so following its donation, arrangements were made with the BNSF to bring the locomotive to Golden. There, the Molson Coors Brewery graciously agreed to store the locomotive for a short while on its extensive plant railroad until the Colorado Railroad Museum could arrange for its final movement onto the museum grounds. That final move took longer than anticipated to arrange, but finally, in 2018, one of the most newsworthy events in the history of the Colorado Railroad Museum took place when the tunnel motor was finally moved. You see, there still was no direct rail connection. Instead, the locomotive would be moved to the nearest road crossing, then lifted off its own wheels for a journey down 44th Avenue. That journey would be interrupted by a trip on rails to cross a bridge that wasn't rated for the cranes being used. Then, the cranes took over again, finally delivering the locomotive onto the museum's grounds where it resides today. Since its arrival, our tunnel motor has had its patch numbers removed by volunteers, its letterboards replaced, and its Rio Grande lettering touched up to return it to the appearance it had for most of its life. One final note, the SD40 locomotive model in all of its variations, including the tunnel motor, was one of Electromotive's most popular. Over 5,000 were sold during the production time frame. Number 5401, with its special tunnel motor connection, is a fitting and appropriate example to be preserved here at the Colorado Railroad Museum alongside numerous other Colorado railroading icons. Thank you for joining us today.
If you enjoy our content, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Sharing and commenting in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.